Many forms of media, such as television and film, have had repetitive patterns of falsely identifying what symptoms are associated with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD for short. While there are some positives with the mass amount of representation, there is also negative connotations with what information is provided and how it is incorporated. Determining what information is stereotyped and what is a true symptom of ASD is important when attributing how to properly and respectfully go about representing the disorder across media. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the video adaptation of my senior thesis, The Representation of Autism Within the Media, Negative and Positive. The topic of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD as I will refer to it throughout the rest of this video, has become a popular discussion point within the media in recent times. There appears to be a response for people to want proper representation from every aspect of humanity, whether it be race, gender, sexual orientation, or political alignment. One of these representations has been for ASD and the desire to properly portray what the disorder is like. While many are still unfamiliar with the topic, any sort of representation of autism in the media seems to, for the most part, receive praise for its depiction and taken as an honest portrayal of how it functions. According to, how the hell do you pronounce this? Okay, sure. According to Draisma, all references, by the way, will be provided in the description of this video. The issue with the logic that is ASD cannot be easily defined by one description. Quote, "There are two options for an autistic person. Either he is mentally handicapped, an egghead reading geek magazines, or he is a savant with mental powers exceeding those of two Cray supercomputers spinning numbers 24 hours a day. It is either diminished capability or superhuman capability, but nothing in between. No one person with ASD is the exact same as another. Everyone's personality differs in a variety of ways, making every human to ever exist truly unique. The same can be said about those with ASD. No one person with it is the same as another, and the effects of the disorder can greatly differ from one person to another. Due to this, the observations of the most famous examples can be very exceptional and not truly represent what the disorder actually entails. This unintentional misunderstanding has led to multiple stereotypes of ASD and an unreasonable set of expectations for those with ASD to aspire to. Oftentimes, these stereotypes can contradict each other, leading to greater confusion and disdain for the disorder. Again, I have to apologize for potentially mispronouncing any of these names. Belcher and Mike? Mike? Mike. Sure, let's go with that. Quote, "Characters portrayed across venues of media that appeal to the eye and emotion, example, movies, and to the mind of reflection, example, literature, differ in significant ways that society at large should be aware of in order to critique their representations." The representation of autism in the media is paramount to public perception, as it determines how those with the disorder are viewed and treated by society. So what is autism? The impairment of autism is one that must be diagnosed for it to be officially acknowledged. In order to obtain a legal diagnosis, the subject in question must fall under a set of criteria laid out by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, also known as the DSM-5. By the way, please keep in mind, as I describe these symptoms and everything attributed to them, this is not a complete overall guarantee that someone with ASD is going to act like this, nor should you be diagnosing anyone yourself. This is just for the sake of providing examples. So please take this information with an understanding point of view for the sake of providing explanation. There are 4 different stages of criteria, some with their own subsections specifying what to expect of someone with the condition. The first criterion is difficulties with social interaction, that branch off into 3 symptoms. The subject must have all 3 symptoms to be diagnosed. The first symptom is difficulties with socializing with others, such as failure to hold a proper back and forth discussion or inability to properly express emotions effectively. The second symptom is difficulties with body language, such as eye contact and posture. The third symptom is difficulties with attaining and maintaining relationships with others who are not the caregivers of the individual, such as the inability to take another's perspective, just as one example. If all of the above symptoms are properly assigned to the subject, the diagnostic process can move to the second criteria, which focuses on repetitive patterns and behaviors. This criterion has 4 symptoms, and an individual must have at least 2 to be diagnosed. The first symptom is repetitive speech or movement. For example, saying a word or phrase repeatedly either back to back or over the course of the day, or fidgeting with a particular object when sitting still. The second symptom is routine patterns of behavior and a resistance to change in said patterns, such as eating at a specific seat every day or walking to a destination along a specific route. The third symptom is abnormally high interests on specific topics or objects, such as a devotion to a particular brand or franchise, or the need to bring an object with them that might otherwise seem abnormal outside of context. The fourth symptom is sensitivity towards certain aspects of a potential environment, such as being uncomfortable with certain sound frequencies or avoidance of certain textures. While it is possible for anyone with ASD to have an assortment of these symptoms, they must have between 2 and 4 of them to be properly diagnosed. If the subject fits the first 2 criteria minimum, the process can then move on to the third criteria. This requires the subject to show signs of behavior listed in the previous criteria within early childhood. These symptoms may not be easily noticeable until the subject is placed in a socially demanding environment, and may not be determinable to their social interactivity until a later age. When referring to early childhood, the DSM-5 specifically refers to, quote, approximately age 18 or younger. However, this window of time is not strict and can allow the child to be somewhat older than that for the diagnosis. The fourth and final criterion is that all of the previous criteria must hold some impairment over the lives of the individuals. These impairments can be calculated on a scale ranging from 1 to 3, 3 being the most severe. The higher the level, the more support the individual needs in order to function with everyday living conditions. If all of the criteria match with describing the subject, then a legal practitioner could officially diagnose them with ASD, so long as there are no better diagnosable disabilities to attribute the symptoms to. Also, please keep in mind, I am very much oversimplifying these symptoms for the sake of putting things in my own words. The best that I could offer is to legit read the DSM-5 yourself, or talk to a legal professional, I don't know what the law has to do with diagnosing, but okay, yeah, sure, talk to a lawyer, but then also talk to a neurologist or a psychiatrist. Anyone who's ever had to read that book, basically. Also, keep in mind that the description of those symptoms were left vague on purpose, because not every individual is going to have the exact same sort of criteria, so they want the fluid openness to be able to diagnose someone who otherwise would not be diagnosable. It's very complicated, but for the sake of the argument that I'm trying to present with today, that is what I'm going to leave it at for now. So now that we've gotten the explanation of what it means to have ASD, for the most part, let's delve into stereotypes. Though there is a proper explanation for what is associated with autism through the above criteria, public perception of what the disorder entails is not made as clear. The general audience will not always be familiar with the DSM-5's diagnosing process. According to Dresma, again, apology, names, I'm not good with them. But according to him, quote, "Today, the processes that shape the general understanding of Asperger's syndrome and autism," side note, Asperger's syndrome is basically also autism due to some stuff that I'm not going to get into why, just know that whenever someone says Asperger's, they also mean autism, have come to be distributed over persons and institutions, literature and film, education and media. A better understanding of the autistic condition and the talents that may come with its demands that we carefully observe the intricate interactions between the expert of autism and the general perception of autism as it manifests itself in the way autistic persons are represented in novels, biographies, autobiographies, and movies. That there is such a thing as a general perception of autism, perhaps best thought of as a set of stereotypes, is generally brought out by what movies need or need not show to explain the autistic condition. I'm gonna be real with you right now. You have no idea how easy it was to actually just Google this topic and find so many papers. It's surprising how many people have done research on this, yet no one seems to talk about it. I'm just gonna put that out there. Alright, end of side note. Some stereotypes have become more prevalent than the actual facts of the disorder. One of these stereotypes is what I will refer to as the savant. This stereotype feeds into the idea that those with ASD are superhuman and better at certain tasks than those who are neurotypical. For example, they could memorize something complicated, such as train schedules, and not need assistance to know when or where a train might come by. Another example is that they are more skilled in a task than most, such as computer engineering. That's a very popular one, by the way. While it is conceivable for those who are autistic to also have savantism, quote, "The majority of cases of autism do not have savantism." The notion that both conditions are one and the same is misguided and highly problematic, as it could lead to unachievable expectations for those with ASD. Although it is not impossible for autism and savantism to be diagnosed within a single individual, the cases of this happening are so rare that it would be unfair to stereotype anyone with ASD as such. The reason the stereotype exists is most likely because of the potentially obsessive nature that some with ASD may possess. Some can be so interested in a topic that they can absorb an immense amount of information, but that does not make the topic explicitly important. It most often involves information regarding facts and trivia rather than skills or abilities. This has led to the misunderstanding that those with ASD are super intelligent and talented, rather than having an obsessive hobby or interest. A second common stereotype is that those with ASD are what I will refer to as slow, or less intelligent than the average person. This normally works in tandem with the savant stereotype, as it will be assumed that if they are exceptional at a task to an above average extent, they could be seen as being so autistic that they become intellectually challenged and incapable of performing any basic tasks. This stereotype can give the impression that those with ASD are less intelligent and therefore not worth as much as those who are neurotypical, leading to potential discrimination due to the "I am better than you" mentality. Similar to the savant stereotype, this one is also untrue in most cases. ASD does not affect intelligence. There are just as many intellectual and non-intellectual individuals diagnosed with the disorder as there are without it. The misguided reasoning for this stereotype to have perpetuated is most likely due to the actions and habits of those with ASD, as they can be seen so eccentric and out of the ordinary. The third stereotype that I'm going to be referring back to is one that I refer to as the emotionless machine. This means that they feel no emotion and are only able to function off of logic. For example, this stereotype would assume that someone with ASD would not care how people feel if others were upset with them, even if the reason was because of something they did. This stereotype also assumes that they are intelligent enough to calculate what to do based off of their predetermined logic, borrowing some factors from the savant stereotype. There is nothing in the DSM-5 that mentions how those with ASD feel no emotion. However, it does state that they struggle with, quote, reducing sharing of interests, emotions, or effects, which is most likely where the stereotype originated. While autistic individuals are capable of feeling emotions, the issue is that they do not know how to understandably show it and are often blunt with what they have to say, leading to the logical thinking aspect of the stereotype. A lack of emotion is often associated with other mental issues, as is depression, and should not be confused with feeling nothing at all. Sorry, that's my little podium that I have to the side. I'm going to put that away for now, and now I'm going to bring it back for the rest of this video. These stereotypes have been accumulating false pretenses of what it means to be diagnosed with ASD. Some of their positive aspects can be detrimental, with the misguided information providing unachievable expectations. As the stereotypes have perpetuated into the populace, they have, by assertion, infiltrated into the media, leading to these inaccuracies to be taken as fact. This has led to the improper representation of those with ASD in many forms of media, and to the biased expectations of those who encounter them. Alright, now let's get to what we're all here for: the actual representations within media. The main issue throughout the media is how ASD is portrayed, which gives a false representation of ASD from different perspectives. There have been examples in multiple forms of media, such as movies, televisions, books, and news coverage, revealed in a manner that viewers will automatically assume is factual and highly sufficient. Oh boy, another name. According to Procono. Okay. According to Procono, quote, media representation practically never accurately portrays social groups as they actually are in reality. While there are some positive and informative representations, ASD is mostly portrayed under pre-established stereotypes. So let's look at each form of media one at a time. And let's start off with television. One of the largest examples of this representation comes from television. Belcher and Mike. Got Mike. Bletcher and Mike quote Patch, who said, quote, it's clear that some of the challenges faced by the autistic population have captured the imagination of TV writers, who are increasingly penning eccentric characters whose quirks would seem to align with typical characteristics of ASD. One of these programs is The Good Doctor, which began airing on the ABC network on September 25th, 2017. The basic premise of the show is that the main character, Sean Murphy, is an individual diagnosed with ASD and is capable of performing surgery at a level far greater than that of any of the other doctors. This falls under the savant stereotype, as he is shown to be much more intellectually inclined on the topic of surgery than the professionals who have been practicing medicine longer than he has. It is mentioned within the trailer for the show how he also has savantism, but that also indicates that both impairments are interchangeable. Perhaps if they were to focus more on him being a savant rather than making him autistic, the show could have showcased a more obscure disorder. Instead, they decided to diagnose him with both savantism and ASD in order to have a compelling narrative with his intelligence and the awareness of their disorder of choosing being ASD. Basically, they didn't care that it wasn't actually autism that was causing the symptoms that are portrayed in the show. They just want that clout, being that, oh, we have someone autistic as the main character on our show, and they talk to actual medical professionals just to be able to say, look, we can back up our claim. These guys say, and they're just like, actually, that's more in line with savantism. It's like, okay, fucking make him a savant too. Like, you get what I mean? It just kind of comes off as pandering to those who want mental health awareness in their media, I guess. It's kind of like they're taking advantage of the fact that ASD exists. While this tends to be the draw of the show, there are moments where they try to incorporate actual symptoms of autism. For example, Sean walks into a room and is irritated by the noises emitting from the fluorescent lights. It is also shown that he carries around with him a toy surgical scalpel. These are accurate examples of how someone with the disorder would act, and shows that the creators behind the making of the show have some knowledge about ASD. This is made true for the actor portraying Sean as well, Freddie Highmore. In an interview with The View, yes, I am actually using an interview from The View as a reference, do not judge. He mentions how many people look to... I can't say this with a straight face, I'm sorry. He mentions how many people look to the show for inspiration and understanding of how autism works. The unfortunate reality is that not many people who watch the show are going to learn about autism to the extent that the show is aiming for. I'm just going to refer to them as B and M. They actually cited Dreisma, interestingly enough. So I got two sources confirming this, by the way, saying that, quote, there is a strange discrepancy between the research that their directors, script writers, and actor put in when they make a film featuring autistic persons and the actual characters they come up with. They all want an absolutely sincere and truthful rendition of autism. What they come up with is an autistic character with freak-like savant skills, unlike anything resembling a normal autistic person. So basically, because all three of these individuals, the directors, the screenwriters, and the actors portraying them, they all have their different ideas of what it means to be autistic, instead of, doing the research together, like people. They instead go off of their own predetermined notions or whatever research they did individually, because God forbid you have a fucking chance to study this stuff together so you're all on the same page. But you know what? Who needs cooperation when you can get a fat check and just tell actors to do it themselves? All of their different ideas of what it means to be ASD kind of conflict with each other, and it kind of makes this Frankenstein's monster of a stereotype, and it just ends up being kind of unique to the media itself. It just kind of like, it exists in its own little bubble, and there's no real comparison like it, even in other media that have ASD represented. And it's kind of weird. It's so hard to describe this sort of phenomenon, because it's like, if you're going to cast a black actor, he's just going to be black on screen, and there's no complications with that. With this, there's a lot more to take into account. And it gets really confusing really quickly. Even when ignoring that the selling point of the show is based on an inaccurate stereotype, ASD varies so drastically from person to person that having only one character representing it could lead to broad assumptions for what the disorder is like as a whole. I'm not saying to ignore any inspiration from any character with ASD, but I'm saying don't make it a sole inspiration. It's not a good mindset to have when it comes to this topic. Highmore also mentioned in that interview that he believes the show is providing a message of hope and optimism, most likely referring to the success his character has achieved within the context of the show. This statement by Highmore indicates that there is more of a focus on the intellectual side of his character to gain interest from viewers, rather than his social capabilities, which is what the disorder holds a much more dominant impairment over. While there are attempts to showcase the accurate conditions of ASD, it has become clear that ASD is being used more as a narrative structure in use for the plot, and less as a discrete tool to utilize as a means to teach the audience about the condition. By the way, as I go through these examples, please understand, I'm not saying if any of these examples of media are bad or good, unless I explicitly explain my opinion being that. I personally don't think that The Good Doctor is bad, but I haven't really seen enough of the show to make that determinable opinion, personally. All I can say is what I've done my research for the show on. And what I have done it on is of the premise, interviews, and the trailer. So, listen, man. I don't have the time to watch a whole series. I'll watch like an episode or two and then just like yeet myself to the next topic. Speaking of which, another example of ASD representation in television is the show Touch, which aired on the Fox network from January 25th, 2012 through May 10th, 2013. This show focuses around Jake... But... What the okay? Bomb? Boom. Why not? A young boy who is depicted to have autistic characteristics while also focusing on his father Martin. While some of the focus is put on their relationship with one another, the main appeal of the show is how Jake is able to predict the future by mathematically calculating it. Yes, you heard that right. That's a real show that exists. Most of the drama comes from Martin having to figure out what his son is trying to tell him, as he is nonverbal, meaning he does not speak. The only time he is ever depicted talking is when he is thinking to himself, and the audience can hear his thoughts. It's weird, because he's like talking to the audience, and he kind of looks at the camera. He doesn't open his... It's kind of... I would say creepy, but let's be honest, pretentious. The show's creator, Tim Kring, what a great name, expressed how he did not want the focus of the show to be around autism, but instead around Jake's special powers. When the Boston Globe interviewed Kring, they explained that he said, in creating Jake, he deliberately wanted the boy, quote, cut off from the rest of humanity, someone who could neither speak nor be touched. Bad touch, stranger danger! Kring is no stranger to giving everyday people superhuman abilities, as he was also the driving force for the hit television series Heroes. Can you believe it? Oh, by the way, The Good Doctor was also made by the guy who made House! Can you believe that? Just, I don't know what that guy has with, like, taking British actors, giving them American accents, and putting them in a hospital setting. It's very weird. In that show, the characters with powers were diverse in race, age, intelligence, and motivations. In Touch, there only seems to be one power, Jake's, and more people other than him can have it. This puts an unusual spotlight on Jake as a character. Rather than having a mix of backgrounds, opinions, and beliefs in the case of Heroes, Touch has one character to judge in terms of powers, making it easier to marginalize his character. It does not help that his abilities come from being able to calculate effectively while almost all of the characters and heroes obtain their powers through genetic mutations upon birth. And they just get the ability to use them randomly throughout their life. Taking in Kring's work as a whole, it is easy to see that he likes to give powers to those who seem to be the most unlikely, but any viewer of Touch who may not be aware of that context will see the show in isolation, and the show should therefore be judged as such. Although briefly touched upon, see what I did there? The show also alludes to Jake as having ASD. Excuse me. It is refreshing how it is not a central focus for his character, but it still seems to imply, even if unintentionally, that every person with ASD has the superpower to calculate the universe. Jake's high intelligence encourages the savant stereotype, although it is reasonable to imagine how most to all viewers of the show will be able to suspend their sense of disbelief, as it is obvious that no one can predict the future. But the choice to allude to him being autistic has the potential to be more damaging than helpful. Probably the most unique instance of representation is with the 15th episode of the second season of the show Girl Meets World, which aired on the Disney Channel on September 11th, 2015, and is a follow-up show of the series Boy Meets World. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have gone there. The show focuses primarily on the character Riley Matthews and her friends throughout everyday experiences as a teen attending high school. In this particular episode, many of the adult characters on the show believe that Farkle— yes, I did not stutter! His name is Farkle! I made a D&D character with a name similar to that. I didn't think it was real. Farkle, one of Riley's friends and practical main character of the show. I say that because Riley is the star, but he's like the next star up, if that makes sense. He's like Sam from iCarly. It's like, she's not the main focus, but she's one of the main characters. That's Farkle. So anyway, some of the adults think that he might be autistic. It was already determined within the same episode that he has been classified as a genius, so they wish to conduct testing on him in order to determine whether he has ASD or not. Meanwhile, Farkle is nervous about the potential results of this testing because he is having an identity crisis over the possibility of being autistic. By the way, I saw snippets of this episode, but most of this information legit came from the wiki. Like, yes, this show has a wiki, and it's as hilarious as you can imagine it. I highly recommend giving it a read. After his friends reassure him that they would not change their opinion on him even if he was, they do their own research on what it means to be autistic. When it is discovered that those with ASD have difficulty with forming relationships, including those of romance, which is an— thank you, Discord. Which is an actual symptom, which we had previously discussed, if you recall. Farkle requests that his friends encourage him to pursue relationships in that area. They comply with this notion by encouraging him to go on a date with the character— I'm sorry, man, it's just— I know it's the Disney Channel, but god damn it, I have to draw the line in the sand at some point. Smackle! Encouraging him to go on a date with the character Smackle. Another highly intelligent individual around the same age. Who would have thunk it? Later on in the show, the tests confirm that Farkle does not have autism, but Smackle reveals to everyone that she does. This concerns her because she does not know if a relationship between someone who is autistic and someone who is not can work. Farkle, as well as other characters on the show, believes that this relationship can work out. The episode ends with them hugging over their new relationship. Okay, so I want to have a moment of silence to just take all that in for a second. Okay, silence over. Some publications praise this episode for shedding a light on an otherwise obscure topic of discussion, especially for a Disney Channel series. HuffPost News, I guess not Huffington Post, but is HuffPost News? I don't know how that works. Don't... Look, man, I do the research. Alright. Said, quote, "It's refreshing and necessary to realize that normal doesn't need to be the goal." Okay, side tangent. Who's just... Who here says that being autistic isn't normal, okay? Who clarified what is and is not normal? Sure, it's not talked about or expressed all that often in media in general, or just in public discourse, but at the same time, with how many people who are diagnosed out in the world, what makes you think that's normal? What makes you the de factor of what is and is not normal? Huh? That's what I thought. K? I'm gonna call you K, and I'm not gonna look up how to pronounce it, just to get at you. But still, apologies if I mispronounce it. The way that the show initially came across, it felt as though they decided to give Farkle ASD for no other reason than to have someone on the show with ASD. After the decision to not diagnose Farkle, this instead shows that they wanted to have ASD as a topic of discussion without compromising the characters that they have already established, though one could argue the opposite since they still confirmed Smackle's diagnosis. Still though, she's not a main character, so who's to say? The episode does bring up interesting topics of discussion, as well as questions of self-identity and what it means to be autistic. But one major issue is that the characters they choose to have as the recipients of this character arc. Farkle is a quirky character who is very blunt with his statements and has difficulty picking up on social cues. It is not out of the ordinary to have a character such as this in a live-action children's show, as there have been many examples from other shows. For example, the show iCarly had a character called Gibby, a somewhat chubby comic relief character. The difference between Farkle and a character like Gibby is that Farkle is also a literal genius. Both him and Smackle, I'm saying this with a straight face, goddamn, what has my life come to, are depicted as autistic mostly because of their above-average intelligence. This feeds into the savant stereotype. While it would be interesting to see Gibby diagnosed, it appears that it would never be considered to have someone seemingly unintelligent as autistic because of how they might not want to offend anyone. Also, I'm just going to say it right now, if you decide to, at some point later in the lifespan of your show, make the comic relief character ASD, then you better handle that very respectfully. Otherwise, it's just going to come across as like, oh, like, we're laughing at his expense, you know? So just be on eggshells if you decide to go down that route. The issue with this way of thinking is that it is not fair to have anyone else with ASD as smart, because not all of them are. It is reasonable to believe that the ratio of smart and not smart people without ASD would be similar to people with ASD. While it does continue to perpetuate the stereotype, it is valiant of an effort to see a channel like the Disney Channel, who have a history of being as uncontroversial as possible, to tackle a topic that not many of their targeted demographic are fully aware of or understand, and attempt to educate them on such an issue. So while they may not have handled it in the most preferred ways that I would have wanted, I still absolutely commend them for going through with it. for what it's worth. While the savant seems to be the more prominent stereotype, the emotionless machine is another common description of those with ASD. One of these examples can be seen in the Netflix series Atypical, which began airing on August 11th, 2017, and is currently still in production. In this show, the main character is Sam Gardner, an 18-year-old in high school who is diagnosed with ASD. The premise of the show is to showcase the type of life Sam lives and how he thinks, acts, and reacts. There is also a large focus on the rest of his family and how his condition has affected them and their daily lives. The main struggle for the show includes how Sam is trying to find a love life, his sister going to a new school, and his mother having an affair. This is at least a description of Season 1. I didn't watch Season 2 for this, but honestly, I kinda don't want to. I don't think you'll lose any sleep over it. And it's interesting too, because when I was watching it, I was enthralled and found myself enjoying and agreeing with a lot of stuff that was happening in the moment, but the more I think about the show, well, let's just say the more I thought about it, the more objective I became in my paper. I firmly believe that Sam is one of the best examples of ASD representation in terms of showcasing conditions and perpetuations that one might have when diagnosed. He is a likable and relatable character, and does not fall to the savant stereotype. At least, not completely. He is shown to be highly intelligent, but not to the degree of any of the previous examples. That being said, he seems to hold more characteristics of ASD than one might have. At least, one might have realistically. Sam is an expert at biology, more specifically with the Antarctic region. This highly obsessive interest is a symptom of ASD as stated before, but he seems to have other talents on top of this. He is a skilled artist, as shown by the sketches seen in his book, and is capable of operating and fixing machinery given his occupation at the technology store. While it is possible to have all of these traits, it comes across as the writers giving Sam all of these qualities without taking into account how they seem to conflict with each other. While this is admittedly a minor complaint, the real issue is the way, or lack thereof, Sam expresses himself. While it is accurate in how overly blunt he speaks, his monotone voice and inability to understand slang perpetuates the emotionless machine stereotype. While it would make sense that he would not understand sarcasm and some jokes, with how intelligent Sam is portrayed, he should be able to distinguish slang and phrases from meaning what they are literally saying, but instead he takes them all literally for comedic effect. Like, you're telling me he's never even heard of these phrases before in his life and come to learn and better understand them over time? Like, it would make sense for, like, maybe a few, but it's like, he's like Amelia Bedelia. It's just like, every single phrase, every single meaning of a phrase is tossed aside to be taken literally. And I would say the joke got old, but honestly, I would say it's hard to get old when you're not funny the second time around. Yes, I use a super hot fire meme in current year. What are you gonna do about it? Look, if everyone else is doing it, that means I could get away with it, right? This trivializes the ability of someone with ASD to interpret something if it does not make sense to them. If at certain points he were to ask those he spoke to if what they were saying is a phrase or figure of speech, then it would be more understandable when still coming across as humorous. Like, I'm not gonna lie, the concept of someone with ASD in an average everyday environment is humorous. I've been there, I've witnessed it happen. It's funny, dude! But at the same time, it's like, this is not the humor that you're looking for. With how
lower needs
he is shown to be, and that he is 18, it would be expected that he would come across some scenarios involving slang in his past and be more familiar with the concept and even a few examples. So it becomes distracting when he reacts the same way every time, such as when he decides to go to the mall to shop and dives into the pool to retrieve a necklace, essentially going against his usual fears, putting himself into uncomfortable situations. As it was pre-established, he doesn't like going to the mall because it's loud there, and he doesn't like going into the pool because it's like, I guess he just doesn't like feeling completely wet, especially when he was in a suit, but also the pool just might be dirty. I don't remember. It was like explained in the last episode, but he didn't want to go in the pool, but he knew he had to, so he decided to do it anyway. It was, I'm not gonna lie, unabashedly courageous. It would not be considered a stretch that he could grow in other ways as well. It is clear that Sam feels emotions in the show, as he provides narration about his difficulty in properly expressing empathy. But having him not pick up certain phrases boxes him into a perceived robot, incapable of thinking any way other than logically. This also contradicts how he was able to tell jokes to himself. When his father says that he will build him the best igloo he had ever seen, Sam replies by mentioning how he has only seen one other igloo in his life, so he hopes it will be better, and then immediately chuckles to himself. If he is capable of making and understanding jokes, even if not every single time, it should not be unreasonable to have him also sometimes assume when someone is speaking in slang. I feel the character of Sam could have been handled a lot more delicately, I suppose. It could have been handled better. However, the worst that I can say about this show, at least its first season, is that its depiction is fine, I guess, but I will commend them for trying their best, and also even providing a perspective on the family, which was interesting. And goddammit, I wish my dad was that fun. A character similar to Sam would be Max Braverman? I believe that's how you pronounce it. Good enough. From the show Parenthood, which aired on NBC from January 29th, 2015 to March 2nd, 2019. Max is approximately the same age as Sam and shares many mannerisms. For example, Max speaks in a monotone voice and has a vast interest in wildlife and bugs, instead of penguins. He is able to come to conclusions just through observation and uses logic to define his interest in bugs. His character is just as realistic of a depiction of ASD as Sam, in that they are great, but still fall under the emotionless machine stereotype. From my experience with autistic individuals, most of the time, they tend to act the opposite. Many diagnosed with ASD are overly expressive to the point where some might find it obnoxious. This can be conflicting when trying to write a character for a television show, and no one would want to portray a character to be unlikable while also having ASD. It is understandable why this has yet to happen, and both Sam and Max are the least offensive characters explored so far, but at some point, a character like that should be created to give a better, encompassing idea of what ASD is like. They do not have to mean to be obnoxious, as they can be allowed to have a moment to seriously apologize for any unintended negative behavior. While characters like Sam and Max can exist, and yes, I did say that on purpose, there should also be a wider range of emotions being displayed by those portraying ASD in the future. Okay, enough of this episodic bullshit. Let's get into the real meat of the matter. Film! Another popular form of media is film. The 1988 film Rain Man... He said it! He said the thing! We can move on now! Directed by Barry Levinson, is a well-known film where one of the main characters has been diagnosed with autism. The film stars Tom Cruise as Charlie Babbitt and Dustin Hoffman as Raymond Babbitt, who has a diagnosis of autism. Charlie reconnects with Raymond, discovers that they are brothers, and finds himself learning how to understand and love him. In Prochnow's analysis of the film Rain Man, he points out that the actions and mannerisms that Raymond showcases throughout the film are reminiscent of diagnosable symptoms of ASD. For example, he repeatedly mentions throughout the film that he is, quote, a good driver. As previously explained, one of the symptoms of ASD is to repeat a phrase many times. Another example is how when standing up, Raymond often swings his body from left to right, which can be interpreted as a repetitive motion. Author Nils Skudra, is that a Pokemon?
Nils Skudra.
I mean, I guess I got it right. Who has a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, points out in his article, A Look Back at the Movie Rain Man and How Our Views of Autism Have Changed, quote, enormous strides have been made in our knowledge of autism in the 30 years since Rain Man's release. Rain Man is the earliest example that I'm going to be pointing at, and while there are definitely some other examples that I could point to that are even earlier than Rain Man, I don't think anyone really cared to portray it as much or as drastically before Rain Man than they have after. So I'm not going to focus too much on anything before 1988 because, again, I want to focus on the modern day and the modern media. And the late 80s is as far away from modern as I'm willing to go. In the movie, Raymond displays autistic behaviors such as repetitive statements, lack of eye contact, hypersensitivity to touch, the necessity to follow a routine, repetitive rocking, and heightened anxiety. In the film, Raymond's exceptional math skills are shown in the scenes where he was able to count 246 toothpicks that fell on the ground, and when he is counting cards in Las Vegas. Skudra believes that, quote, the film also captures with striking accuracy the sensory difficulties and high anxiety levels that accompany autism's positive aspects. However, Skudra also points out that the film, quote, is also characterized by a significant number of errors in the character's perception of autism. For example, the doctor shares that most people who have autism do not communicate. However, Raymond's ability to articulate and function in a social situation is not consistent with individuals who have been diagnosed with ASD today. A diagnostician would not have characterized Raymond as having
Lower needs.
ASD based on the ability that he can speak. In addition, it is important to point out that Raymond's brother Charlie is not familiar with autism and seems to have a notion that autism is a disease that can be cured. At least at the beginning of the film, Charlie really comes to discover and learn what it means to have ASD, and I will say, I do appreciate the character growth that he went through. Like, say what you will about its representation, the movie itself is great. I will not deny that. It's just that, because of its age, it just it would not have been made the same way today, let's just say that. The truth is that, quote, ASD is a permanent neurological condition that cannot be removed or cured. Despite some of the inaccurate portrayals of individuals who have autism, one can argue that in the film, quote, Hoffman deserves a superb performance as a neurotypical actor portraying an autistic character. Even today, viewers walk away from the film with an understanding of the life of one person diagnosed with autism, and with the increase of diagnosis and media around autism today, hopefully see the strides made within the field. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I watched that movie. That's not Dustin Hoffman. That's a completely different person. I refuse to believe that. It's that convincing. Raymond's depiction of autism is similar to that of Sean Murphy of The Good Doctor. Both of them have recognizable characteristics of ASD, but still fall under the savant stereotype for their above-average abilities. Hell, even in the movie, Raymond is described as an autistic savant, so they have that in common too. One advantage Raymond has over Sean is that Raymond's skills have not been used for as large of a selling point as Sean's. While there is an important plot point with Raymond counting cards while gambling, the focus of his character is of his disorder and how everyone around him acts and treats him. This also seems to be the greater appeal of the film, as audiences seem to enjoy the film to a great extent because of it. While not a perfect example of representation, it did bring about the concept of autism into the public consciousness in a very informative way and tried to introduce a quirky yet interesting character before any stereotypes were introduced, or at least set en route. A somewhat popular use of representation for ASD in film appears to be under the utilization of the romantic comedy genre, or rom-com for short. This genre is showcasing the amazing/embarrassing, yet still romantic side of starting a new relationship. Some examples of rom-coms with ASD representation include Adam, Snowcake, and Mozart and the Whale. Yes, that is a real title of a real movie. Okay, Adam, directed by Max Meyer in July of 2009, is about a man of the same name who starts with a romantic relationship with a neighbor, Beth Butchwold. Okay. Snowcake, directed by Mark Evans, released in September of 2006, is about a man named Alex forming a romantic relationship with a woman with ASD named Vivian, after her daughter lost her life in a car crash where she was a passenger in Alex's car. Yes, that is a real plot to a movie. Don't ask. Mozart and the Whale, directed by Peter Ness.
Yes.
Alright. Mozart and the Whale, directed by Peter Ness, released in April 2006, is about two individuals with ASD, Donald Morton and Isabel Sorensen, forming a romantic relationship with their disabilities causing conflict between them. Each film has an interesting differentiation between them all. Adam shows how Beth's family does not want her dating Adam because they feel he would be too much work to maintain. In Snowcake, both individuals are of a traditionally older age than what is typically found in most rom-coms, and the couple in Mozart and the Whale are both autistic, leading to some interesting and unique interactions between them. While it is worth noting that Adam, Donald, and Isabel all fall under the savant stereotype, I would rather focus why the rom-com is a particular genre for ASD representation. Also, it's worth pointing out, Vivian does not appear to show any stereotypes and comes across as not as
Lower needs.
as the other savant characters, making her a more diverse character when it comes to ASD representation. Now, back to the focus. Most of the comedy in these types of films comes from the unintended awkwardness between the individuals in love. It's just a staple of the genre. The easiest way to reach that type of comedy is to get one or both individuals an unusual personality to add conflict and or confusion between them. With this in mind, it is reasonable to believe that ASD was used to add an attribute to the character in order to drive the comedy aspect of the rom-com forward. While it is admittedly humorous how some with ASD can misunderstand what is and is not appropriate, constantly using them as an easy gimmick to make a story seem new gives off the impression that they are easy to make fun of. Despite being represented, the disability should be seen as more than just a difficult hurdle to overcome. Instead of showing what it is like to start a relationship with someone with ASD, perhaps it would be more valuable to show an ongoing and lasting relationship and the constant and continuous struggles that can come from that. There is a lot of value in providing a spotlight on ASD-involved romance, but if it is still treated as something to laugh at and nothing more, no one will take them seriously. Oh boy, this is the one I've been looking forward to the most. Mercury Rising. If you're like, huh? Just wait. You're gonna love this one. Mercury Rising, directed by Harold Becker, is a film released in 1998 and stars Bruce Willis as the lead role, named Art Jeffries. The Art, I believe, is short for Arthur. I know, I've never heard it like that either, but okay. The plot involves him protecting a 9-year-old autistic boy who has been targeted by the NSA for solving a code in a puzzle book. As strange as the premise may seem, the film spends some time explaining what ASD involves. Unfortunately, the information it gives is incorrect and highly misleading. Like, here's the thing. If the misinformation in this movie weren't so offensive, I would highly recommend this movie as just something to make fun of, like, kind of in a so bad it's good kind of way. Like, here's the thing. The action is ridiculous and stupid because of the premise and stakes. It's just your standard action B movie, but, like, with Bruce Willis as the star, so, Alright, dude, let me break down what's going on. Art is basically a cop, okay, get this, tired of the shit he takes from his boss, okay, alright, you have me going, very original, okay, but, he doesn't necessarily quit, but he has been threatened to be fired and or wants to quit. I don't remember exactly. I mean, I feel like I went through a fever dream watching this. Can you blame me? But then, like, on some other side of town, some kid with autism who has a loving family who the movie just really wants to hammer in. They love their son very much, and they are a very peaceful and inintrusive family. Just mind their own business, loving their son all the time. He loves solving crossword puzzles, so they give him a book with a bunch of crossword puzzles in it. And then he looks at one of the crossword puzzles, and that, like, computer noises go off in the sound. In the movie makes computer-related sounds while he's looking at the crossword puzzle. I wish I could. And then he goes downstairs and calls a number on a phone that is a direct line to an office in the NSA, because the crossword puzzle is actually code for it's basically a new line of code that the NSA is developing to be proven to be unhackable. And they call it Mercury. Oh, I get it now! Anyway, because this kid was able to decipher the code kind of seamlessly, they try to kill him so they can flaunt about how Mercury is unhackable. And that they want to kill him because he's the only thing standing in their way of, like, proving that. So they go to the house, and they kill the parents, try to look for the kid, but can't find him because he's hiding in the wall. But then Art discovers him, and now he has to protect him throughout the rest of the movie. That is the movie. I wish I was making this up. This is a real movie that really existed in 1998. When explaining how the boy, Simon Lynch, was able to solve the code, one of the NSA members says, oh boy, and I quote, "Autistic people are, they're shut off. But it is not unusual for an autistic person to be a savant." As stated previously, ASD has no correlation with savantism or intelligence. Not only does Simon fall for the savant stereotype, but it is blatantly reinforced through dialogue, leading to a greater misunderstanding of the disorder from the audience. There is also the issue of the character Simon himself. While they do get a few things right, like how he does not like to be touched and has difficulty looking in people's eyes, there is also a lot wrong. First, staring at a bunch of random numbers and letters cannot alone decipher code without some sort of instructions. So, for example, if you were told that you have to replace every 4 with the letter L, or replace every D with the letter P, there's no real way to determine how to decipher code without a codec. I'm not too familiar with the topic, but I can guarantee you staring at a bunch of random numbers and letters that are supposedly encrypt something within them is not going to give you a fucking phone number. It also doesn't help with the fact that they play those computer sounds whenever he looks at the code. Second, they also explain how ASD affects emotions and the ability to communicate them. While that is an oversimplification of what should be a complex topic, it is also misconstructed about what ASD really means. It would be better if it was said that he had difficulties communicating, as picking up on and expressing emotions plays a big part in proper communication. There is also the issue with how slow he talks. Well, not impossible, it does feed into the emotionless machine stereotype along with the savant stereotype. It especially plays a role in establishing the slow stereotype. Mercury Rising tries to act as a gateway to giving a proper explanation of what it is like to have ASD, but if they wanted to avoid providing misinformation, they should have just looked for more experienced professionals to act as gatekeepers. Quoting Drazma, quote, "As a rule, movie makers seem to have no trouble finding scientific authorities who are willing to endorse rather than correct the Hollywood stereotypes of the autistic savant." I mean, if you get a big fat paycheck for endorsing, then by all means, sure, but like at the same time, like, have some fucking responsibility. It's not a good sign when one of the central characters of your film harkens towards all three major stereotypes of their specific niche. So, while I will say that the character of Simon is inherently offensive, I will still highly recommend watching Mercury Rising just out of pure ironic value, because there is a lot of shit that does not relate to this topic of discussion that is so hilarious, over the top, and stupid. Alright, let's get into some real shit. The 2017 reboot of the Power Rangers series, directed by Dean Israelite. Is that what that says?
Israelite.
Oh my god, it is. Directed by Dean Israelite, decided to make one of their most iconic characters autistic. Billy Harder, the Blue Power Ranger, was made to represent ASD for the film. While explaining why, Israelite said, quote, "We wanted to take a character like Billy and celebrate those abilities and manifest in a movie the idea that without Billy and without the qualities he has, the team would never be victorious." I'm sorry, like, no. What about him being autistic makes it paramount that they succeed? I'm sorry, I'm gonna try my best not to tangent, but this really pisses me off, okay? One of these qualities Israelite most likely refers to is his calculated mannerisms, such as when he is seen organizing colored pencils. However, the implication of that quality could also have been explained with other impairments, such as obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD. His ASD mostly comes into play when he is shown taking jokes and situations seriously, mostly used for comedic effect. This decision to make this character autistic comes across as an attempt to have representation for the sake of it. This can be seen as more believable when taken into account that the Yellow Power Ranger is LGBTQ+, making it difficult to determine if the inclusion of different demographics was for the purpose of serving the story, or was done so in order to obtain sympathy and favorability from the audience as a way to defend the other choices made for the film. Wow, it's almost like gaining clout is more important than an actual character's character. Also, they make all these advancements in trying to make everything woke and modern day. Meanwhile, that same Yellow Power Ranger is also still Asian. This mentality can be seen as an inability to claim the movie is bad because it showcases an underrepresented minority, or at least have the movie seen with an extra pro when considering the pros and cons. Within my personal opinion, if representation is used for the sake of obtaining credibility and holds no substance to anything else in the story, then I view it more as a con. When filmmaker Jordan Peele makes comments like, "I don't see myself casting a white dude as the lead in my movie," he means that he wants more representation of black creators in lead roles. However, he compensates for this sense of intended inclusion by having the story and context of his films focus primarily around what it is like to be black. If films like Get Out and Us starred white actors for their leading roles, then the meaning and importance of those movies would be completely changed, possibly even lost. Deciding to make a character autistic without taking into consideration what that would mean for them in the broader context of the narrative can come across as lazy at best and insulting at worst. Jack of the Red Hearts, directed by Janet Grillo, released in 2015, is about a girl with fake credentials taking care of a preteen girl with autism, Glory. Out of all of the examples researched for this paper, this is the only example of
higher needs
ASD that I have found, unless you count Snowcake, but sure, maybe. I mean, she's able to own a house. She's still a preteen, so it's kind of hard to determine, but I would argue she is the
highest needs
at the very least. This can help break the mold for what type of autism can be showcased in media. While the film should be praised for providing a fresh perspective on an extremely complicated topic, it still comes with a few minor criticisms. First of all, the tone of the film comes across as somewhat pretentious. There are many shots and angles that show off some colorful imagery, such as a rainbow of light on Glory's face. This could be seen as glorifying, that was actually unintentional, ASD as if it is some wonderful experience to have rather than an impairment and a disability. I understand it is to show that she is essentially able to be entertained and find beauty in simple things that many others take for granted, but the way her perspective is portrayed, bright lights and hearing others through a muffled echo, it feels like they're saying, "This viewpoint is amazing," rather than simply, "This is her perspective." Second, the actor playing Glory, which also, the fact that her name is Glory is just also kind of pretentious, but whatever. I'll admit, that's a very huge nitpick. But the actor playing Glory acts somewhat exaggerated in her depictions of a
higher needs
individual with ASD. For example, there was a scene when biting on a mouth suppressant toy, her eyes would roll back, giving the implication that she feels stimulated. Given the context of the scene, this extra action was unnecessary and feels over the top when trying to convey that she is relaxed. That being said, there is also a lot that the film got right. The portrayal of ASD habits, the methods and treatments to accommodate for them, and also the ability for someone with ASD to grow and learn. While this disability cannot be overcome, it is possible to circumvent certain shortcomings, such as speech and patience. Things that everyone has to learn, but might be slower for anyone autistic. When it is expressed that Glory has difficulty speaking words, at least certain words, having her be able to say the word mommy after having struggled previously is both an inspiring scene and an accurate representation of growth for ASD individuals. Despite its pretentious nature, I would also recommend checking out this movie just to get a more grounded understanding of the disorder. It's not probably going to be my go-to example, but at the same time, it's a relatively good one. Possibly the least offensive representation out of all of my examples. And now we go from the least to the most. A movie that has been released more recently was The Predator. Not Predator or Aliens vs. Predators, but The Predator. Directed by Shane Black. And released in September of 2018. Oh boy. While the main plot is not relevant to the topic of this paper, there is one character in the film, Rory McKenna, a young boy who is portrayed as having autism. At some point, he acquires alien technology and is capable of manipulating it even without ever having seen it prior. The explanation to the audience of how he can is that it is theorized that autism is the next step in human evolution. This is a grave misconception based upon predetermined and false stereotypes. Aside from enforcing the savant stereotype, this bold claim makes those with ASD superior to the neurotypical in every possible way. While some might see this as a positive, it is ultimately harmful, as there is no evidence to indicate such an absurd statement. Although ASD is believed to be linked to the genetic code, it's still a theory. Regardless, referring to a disability as evolution is highly misguided and incredibly insulting to anyone with and associated with ASD. It's one thing to get information wrong. It's another thing to be offensive. And by golly, Shane, you did it. You did what you shouldn't have. Got it wrong. God, if only you actually did some research and bothered to care. Or, better yet, just didn't put it in the movie. Could have just said he was a tech whiz and just made some 90s stereotypes. Would have been much better. Much more appreciative and... whatever. I feel like this is going to be a very uncontroversial take. Fuck this movie. Just actually fuck this movie. Well, I've had my fill of the silver screen, at least for now, so we might as well turn back to man's oldest form of communication. Literature. I mean, I would say I'm sorry if I meant it. Literature has also had its fair share of ASD representation. B&M share that books represent ASD in a complex context of family and community, rife with everyday problems complicated by issues endemic to ASD, thus engaging empathy for readers and healing expression for authors. Their research on the analysis of ASD in children's picture books conclude that, quote, few books allow the students represented in the stories to find themselves in the larger fabric of life outside of home or school, and therefore did not provide readers with non-stereotypical skills for social inclusion. In some cases, it appears that the picture books functioned as self-therapy for parents and authors. One such example is the novel Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, written by author Jonathan Safran... What? God, these names, man! Why do people have them? Jonathan Safran Foer, published in April of 2005. While never intentioned, many have interpreted the main character, Oscar Schell, to be autistic. B&M share that Oscar, quote, exhibits some traits of ASD, example, inventiveness, social awkwardness, sensory issues, repetitive behaviors. When interviewing Foer, the Boston Globe said that Foer never thought of Oscar as autistic, which is not to say he isn't. It's really up for the readers to decide. It's not to say that plenty of descriptions of him wouldn't be fitting, only that I didn't have them in mind at the time. Okay. That sounds like a cop-out to please everyone, but sure, why not? Although not intended, Oscar is seen by many as a positive example of ASD, to the point where the film adaptation includes a scene where it was expressed that Oscar went for testing and the results came back inconclusive. This leaves it up to the viewer whether or not he is or is not autistic. For the sake of analysis, I will treat him as autistic, since many already see him as such, making him an example regardless. My personal belief is, if the author didn't intend it to be of a certain way, then it wasn't of a certain way. He just has this mentality of like, oh, well, anyone can interpret anything they want into any character when reading. It's just... Which is fine, I guess. It's just kind of like... I don't know, a cop-out? The story of Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close is about 9-year-old Oscar and his coming-of-age story about how he tries to reconnect with his dad after having lost him to the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. There are indications of how this character is faithful to the proper representation of ASD. For example, Oscar has an extreme fascination with calculations and the possible message his father left. This unusually obsessive attitude is very reminiscent of one of the symptoms of ASD. While one could argue that he falls under the savant stereotype, his intelligence is never seen as exaggerated and is instead simply above average. Although it could be argued that, considering that he is 9 years old, that he probably is too smart for his own good. I read the book sometime around middle school, where I was already a teenager, so I wouldn't see it as implausible for a kid of his age to be as intelligent as he is depicted in the book. In fact, I found myself relating to the character in the book a lot more than I expected to, which is a good sign in its own right. Although, again, that's up to your interpretation of whether or not a kid can be too smart. That wouldn't necessarily make him a savant, that just makes him intelligent. I mean, there is a difference, you know. In contrast to someone like Raymond from Rain Man, who is capable to do extreme math within his mind, Oscar is simply really good at math and does most of his calculations by hand. I agree that it does help feed the narrative that everyone with ASD is smart, but Oscar's depiction is very grounded in reality and properly showcases what someone with autism is like. Maybe it's best that it wasn't intentionally meant for him to be autistic. Otherwise, they would have probably focused on other things and exaggerated other things and made him out to be unrealistic. It's sad that that is what has to happen for genuine ASD representation when it's not intentional. Also, don't watch the film, read the book. The film's not good. I've seen it. It's just, no, don't. Just don't. Read the book. The book is good. I recommend it. Another example is Kathleen Smith from Mockingbird. No, not How to Kill a Mockingbird, just Mockingbird. Written by Caitlin Erskine. Oh my god, these names.
Catherine Erskine.
Written by Catherine Erskine, published in 2011, the story is about Caitlin, her father, and the rest of her community coping with the loss of many innocent people during high school. I say that like it's the fucking Hunger Games. No, I'm... And the rest of the community coping with the loss of many innocent people during a school shooting. And yes, this was written in 2011. I checked. So ahead of the time she was, unfortunately. And before you ask, it's just a coincidence that these books have in common that the main character loses a loved one due to a tragedy. At least I hope it is. One of these people is Caitlin's older brother, Devin. Her arc in the story is learning that not everything is black or white, situations are complicated and can be difficult to understand or explain. She also begins to learn how to feel empathetic at the end. The story is told from her perspective, so the writing is done to mimic her thoughts. This includes run-on sentences to imply that she is thinking at a fast rate, repetitive phrases to indicate actions or concepts, and a semi-focused structure to indicate that she is not paying attention to everything all the time. This is, so far, the best example of someone with ASD in literature I have seen. Caitlin does not fall under any of the previous stereotypes. She's never shown to be a prodigy at any sort of task, keeping her from being a savant character. Well, it could be argued that she does appear to exert the emotionless machine stereotype with the way she thinks overly logically and literally. This is compounded with the range of emotions that she displays within the book. Like, yeah, she doesn't understand everything around her, but she does get really upset and really angry, and it's very clear when. She gets mad, excited, and empathetic, as stated before. My only criticism is the portion about empathy at the end. They make it out as if she was unable to feel empathy rather than having difficulty understanding or expressing it. Empathy is not something that someone with ASD has to learn, but is instead difficult for them to describe. However, considering that Catherine is a 5th grader, her age could be seen as a way to justify her lack of experience with empathy, as her mind is still developing. While it is still somewhat late for her age, this criticism is very minor when it comes to the representation as a whole. There is also another character in the book by the name of William H., who is also autistic. He is given very little focus, but is described as
lower needs
by the teacher. He is supposedly, quote, very good at soccer and can play the piano. Kaylin also mentions that he eats dirt, but that has not been explicitly confirmed or denied. His talents are never fully explored, so it is difficult to judge how good he really is, but considering that his talents are not uncommon for children his age, it does not seem to fall under the savant stereotype either. Overall, Mockingbird does a great job showcasing the mind of an autistic person without going over the top, and has a clear understanding of how many with the disorder think and feel. It's interesting how the literature section of this essay seems to be the most positively received. It's almost like writers actually care about the characters that they put into their stories, and actually try to make them believable, realistic characters, and not stereotypical caricatures of what they're supposed to be. Wow, imagine that, writers actually caring about what they're writing about. If only directors cared about what they wrote about. Anyway, putting that pedestal away and bringing it back, one other example of literary representation of ASD is the novel The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, written by Mark Haddon, released in 2003. The book is a mystery drama about a boy named Christopher Bone, or Boone? I'm gonna call him Bone just because Boone just sounds weird, and his attempt to discover who killed his neighbor's dog, among other revelations. While it is never mentioned, many believe Christopher to exhibit habits closely associated with ASD due to his strange behavior and difficulties with speaking to other people and new experiences. There should be something said about presumed diagnosing a character. I personally do not believe it is fair for a character to be judged on what their mental disabilities are off of their behavior alone. That is not to imply that it is wrong to speculate, but if anyone with social anxiety is labeled as autistic, that could lead to its own set of problems, most notably how it could create new stereotypes around how neurotypicals cannot have any issues when speaking to others, and vice versa. It is not impossible for someone neurotypical to have other reasons why they could be hard to converse with, such as anxiety or low self-esteem. It is also possible for someone with ASD to be able to speak publicly without any indication that it is hard for them. That being said, the author of the novel, Mark Haddon, has explained that he believes Christopher to be autistic.
If you were diagnosed, you would be diagnosed as having Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism. He has a serious difficulty with life in that he really doesn't empathize with other human beings. He can't read their faces, he can't put himself in their shoes, and he can't understand anything more than the literal meaning of whatever's said to him. Although I'm very careful in the book not to actually use the word Asperger's or autism, because I don't want him to be labelled, and because as with most people who have a disability, I don't think it's necessarily the most important thing about him. It's not a novel about a boy who has Asperger's syndrome. It's a novel about a young mathematician who has some strange behavioural problems.
Okay, that's another can of worms to have to tackle. Okay, so sure, it's not about him with his diagnosis or his disorder or whatever you want to label it as, but don't you think that some sort of throwaway line about him being autistic at some point in the novel would be beneficial towards the perception of his character and what you were trying to go for. Because if this was your intention, then fine. But, I don't know, purposefully keeping that out of the novel itself, I don't know. It's technically canon, I guess, but it's like not at the same time. It's this weird purgatory area. But whatever. This makes sense, as his history does not have any difference whether or not he has ASD. However, him acknowledging Christopher as ASD can be a dangerous use of character. Right off the bat, he is a mathematical genius, labeling him as a savant. The character is also obsessed with numbers and believes in absolutes, meaning he is logical and will only follow facts that he can determine for himself. This also could lead into the emotionless machine stereotype. It is understandable that if a character seems to be establishing traits that are similar to that of a disorder, like ASD, which Christopher does admittedly seem to accurately follow occasionally, you would want that character to be a form of representation for such a minority party. The issue is, if that decision is made, there has to be some level of research done to ensure that the character displays the actual symptoms of the disorder without falling into the traps of commonly reorganized stereotypes. Oh boy, here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, we have found ourselves in a new territory. The wild card. The absolute unit that is news and internet. The news and the internet are other greater sources for representation of lesser known groups. The representation of ASD is seen differently in these medias than it would be in an expressive form of media, like television, film, or literature, as they are focused on their own set of stereotypes. So like the stereotypes that I've established at the beginning of this paper and I've been going through with examples, they do not apply with this subject, as there are complete different separate stereotypes to take into consideration with this. Now you're probably wondering, well, if it has nothing to do with what you've established, why are you bringing it up in the paper? Well, two reasons. One, I needed to reach 40 pages. Two, it's really important to talk about this stuff because it's just as dangerous, if not even more so, because of the real-world implications, considering that none of these people are actors. It is within the understanding that the news specifically is taken as fact, but some news stations have transitioned to obtaining their news information from social media, like Facebook and Twitter. The issue with that is that not everyone can be taken as a credible source online. This has led to waves of incorrect information being taken as fact. One such example of this misinformation is the notion that vaccines cause autism. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are going down that path. According to Poltkin, Gerver, and Offit, there have been multiple investigations in an attempt to find any link between vaccines and autism, and all of them, and I quote, found no differences in autism rates among vaccinated and unvaccinated children. It would not make sense if there was a correlation, as ASD is a neurological disorder and vaccines are involved within the immune system. These are two vastly different aspects of the human body and hold very little interaction with each other. The main reason this has become so widespread is because of a report made by former Dr. Andrew Wakefield, where he purposefully selected subjects that would help to back up his claim that there was a link between vaccines and ASD, leading to misguided and improper research, leading to the revocation of his license. So, long story short, because this guy skewed the facts to favor those who pretty much paid him to do the research, he had his doctorate revoked. He is no longer a doctor, and his article has been stripped down and treated as no longer credible. And yet, it is the most cited, non-credible article in the history of the world. Man, some people are just paranoid for no fucking reason. Oh, research? What's that? Oh, ideology and bias? What's that? I'm sorry, this shit actually, unironically, pisses me off, and I will never not get offended by anything like this. Saying blank causes autism without having any sort of scientific backing that's credible. I'm sorry. Just stop, look in a mirror, and reevaluate everything you just fucking said. You slime balls. The unfortunate consequences as a result is that some have seen the research as truth, and therefore decided not to vaccinate their children in response. Because of that, the measles... Literally the next sentence I wrote. I'm just ahead of myself. This has led to outbreaks of viruses, such as measles, due to a lack of herd immunity, or reliance on the majority being immune to prevent the spread of diseases. In the case of ASD, according to B&M, quote, many media-based portrayals of ASD as misrepresentative even amped to do harm. They go on to explain that, quote, the public appears to prefer these stereotypical
fictional
examples. Young concluded from his research on the representation of ASD characters in the media that, quote, concluded that since movies serve to reflect reality, misrepresentations can have a major impact on the behaviors and attitudes of audiences towards those with disabilities. The power that the internet holds to telegraph certain information can prove to be extremely harmful when taken too seriously and left unchecked, especially when taken out of context. Another uniform depiction of ASD in the media has been in the news due to the coverage of school shootings within the U.S. Some of the shooters responsible for these irredeemable acts, most notably the Sandy Hook shooting from 2012, are thought to have ASD. This is extremely harmful to assume, as it is normally confirmed that they have some other mental disability instead of potentially another mental impairment in addition to ASD. Regardless of what is true or not, it would be unreasonable to assume that ASD would be the reason anyone would act this way. Unfortunately, the reception to shooters possibly having ASD has raised concerns about the disorder and the violent acts others diagnosed might make. Oh no, you don't understand it. This marginalized group of minorities are just more violent. It's a fact. By who? Me. 'Cause my feelings tell me how to make decisions. According to the Washington Post, when interviewing a lead researcher, they made the claim that, quote, we're not saying people with autism will be serial killers. It's way too early to make any statements like that. My dude, do you not realize you're like... That's the equivalent of being like, I'm not sexist, but... like... Dude, just no, please, stop. This suggests that they believe ASD could be potentially responsible for the actions taken as opposed to the individual themselves and their treatment or upbringing. Time wrote an article that at first seemed to indicate that autism was not the cause of the shooting. However, the last line of the article states that the shooting could teach us, quote, how it affects our children, our families, and our society. This, instead, indicates that the ASD diagnosis held some responsibility for their actions. Everything mentioned previously in the paper then holds new contexts. While ASD is not to blame, it should still be dealt with to prevent anyone with the disorder from lashing out. This not only negates the purpose of what the article sets out to accomplish, but also reinforces the idea that those with ASD are one push away from becoming a school shooter. The idea that ASD is any way capable of increasing the chances that someone will act out in such an aggressive and violent behavior is incorrect and highly disrespectful. According to the Learning Spectrum, quote, "There is no proven connection between autism and this type of school violence." They go on to say that it becomes the complete opposite in most cases, and those with ASD will become the targets of violence and bullying, as opposed to being the aggressor. Explaining how ASD can lead to excess violence can bring with it a new stereotype of how those with ASD are murder-happy psychopaths, perpetuating the detachment from the rest of society and a communicating stigma towards mental health in general. The connection between ASD and school shooters should not exist without proper reasoning and evidence. As more often, there will be more serious and occasionally preventable explanations. An exclusively internet-focused aspect are memes. Just stick with me, okay? Meme is a catch-all term for humor-based imagery or phrases with the intention of acting as a sort of inside joke. They are difficult to explain as a whole, but for the sake of getting the point across, I will only be focusing on one meme specifically. Autistic screeching. While a handful of memes reference the joke of those with autism having loud and high-pitched voices, especially when yelling, the autistic screeching meme is the simplest example to explore. The concept behind the meme is that it starts out as a template, which depicts two men shaking hands, indicating that they are cooperating and getting along. To the right, there is a crudely drawn person squatting with their legs spread apart and their hands in the air. The words autistic screeching are depicted above this individual, indicating a disapproval of the previous two men. The meme was created in 2016 and received some interest in how effective it was at making fun of people online that got annoyed or upset from people or groups working together. They ranged from companies getting upset when other companies collaborate because they look uncooperative in comparison, to fans of a certain series upset over certain characters falling in love when they want other characters to get along. And yes, I did take these images off of knowyourmeme.com. It does not take long to see how this could come across as offensive, as it stereotypes those with autism to be obnoxious screamers. My personal opinion is that I feel conflicted. It is unfortunate that this is what was used to convey the joke, but I find difficulty in what could be a replacement phrase to autistic screeching and come across just as humorous. Memes are never meant to be taken seriously, as most use a dark and purposefully offensive tone when expressed. Most who partake in meme culture never actually believe the things said or expressed because the joke is in how over the top the reaction is, most likely to keep away anyone who does not understand the point of their humor. With that concept in place, the meme itself is inoffensive, but the issue is the viewer. This is where my conflict with the meme is most prevalent, as anyone can see the image regardless of context. This could lead to less informed individuals viewing the meme and taking the information as fact. Autistic people scream loudly and high-pitched. The meme itself has remained relatively obscure, and will probably not be used often anymore considering its age, but it should be understood that the only offensive takeaway from this meme is not the meme itself, but the unintended misinterpretation from someone less informed about the nature and culture of online internet humor. Look guys, just know that just because something can be taken as funny or humorous, that does not mean that everyone who finds it funny takes it as fact. And that's a huge and important distinction, not only for anyone to view any sort of media, but just humor in general. There is such a thing as good taste or bad taste. I have seen some memes that try to use autism as a punchline joke and have gotten offended by just how bad it was incorporated, or at least how lazy and lackluster and unnecessary it was. Just meme responsibly. That is my PSA. Thank you. Alright, so we've gone through our fair share of examples of different types of media and different versions of that media. So now, let's get a little more personal and introspective. What about the characters themselves in these examples? Through the myriad of examples that were listed in terms of ASD representation, all of them fall under 3 different characteristics of representation: a protagonist, a side character, or if done simply for the sake of inclusion. The protagonist and side character roles are self-explanatory, as they are either the main focus or less focused characters respectively. But the for the sake of inclusion character is more difficult to explain and is more based around theoretical concepts. This character, which I will refer to as an included character, holds little to no importance over the story that they are put into and are only incorporated into it so that the creator can be seen as progressive and non-discriminatory. Or if the character is important, then they just make them autistic for no fucking reason. This could work as a character without ASD being retconned to have had the disorder the whole time. An example of a protagonist character would be someone like Raymond from Rain Man, or Oscar from Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. An example of a side character would be the child from The Predator, or Simon from Mercury Rising. An example of an included character could also describe Billy from the Power Rangers reboot, as well as Farkle/Smackle from Girl Meets World. Look, as much as I kind of gave the Disney Channel as much praise as I could, like, you can't deny that was a very included character kind of moment that they dealt with that episode. While the protagonist and side characters are proper ways to portray any character in general, regardless of whether or not they have ASD, utilizing an included character can come across as pandering, desperate, disrespectful, and lacking in any original ideas. A protagonist is often the main focus of the story. Whether the narrative is about the character developing over time, or is instead a journey through their perspective, depends on the type of story the character is put into. Side characters are presented in a similar manner, as they are focused on or related to the plot. Side characters normally act as either companions that assist or obstacles to overcome. Regardless, they are not as important for a role as the protagonist, and are mostly incorporated to either enhance already existing themes or provide new ones that complement the main theme. For example, if a story were focused around what it means to be an astronaut, the main character would understandably be an astronaut in training, or a fan/critic of astronauts. They would learn the joys and hardships of being an astronaut and would most likely obtain a changed perspective by the end of their journey. The side characters would act as ideals for the protagonist to understand and relate to, such as an astronaut who views his work in a negative fashion because he cannot see his family often, or a young boy who looks up to astronauts and dreams of becoming one. The intention of a side character is that they should be used for the protagonist to gain insight from, so that they can make what they believe is the right decision based off of their own experience and the experiences of the side characters. If either of these types of characters become included characters, the dynamic structure between protagonist and side character become invalid. When a character is provided a characteristic, such as ASD, that does not matter to any part of the story, the correlation that they have with the story, and possibly the other characters, will become confusing to the viewer, leading to resentment and uncomfortable disagreement. When observing the main characters from Mockingbird and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, we can see that their use of having ASD is reflected in the writing, as it shows us how they think and what they say. In Mercury Rising, the use of Simon and his autism was for the sake of the plot, regardless of its practicality. For representation to function properly, The characters must work in tandem with the story so that whatever characteristic they need to have to provide said representation does not appear for no reason and can be used to reflect on the story or how the story is told. The most prevalent ASD stereotype represented in media is the savant stereotype. It is present in almost every example showcased. The perpetuation of the notion that those with ASD are super smart geniuses can lead to unintended consequences in the future. While one could see this as a positive, the ramification of misinformation is dangerous regardless of intent or positive contribution. Anthony Baker, a father of a boy with autism, stated, quote, "When he tells people that his son is autistic, they usually ask whether he is a savant as well. When he answers that he is just autistic, it is as if people think that his son is doubly challenged." If someone with ASD is not smart enough to live up to savant-level expectations, then they are perceived as incapable of any intellectual thoughts, opinions, or discussions. There is no chance for someone with ASD to be seen as being average in intelligence. It is either one extreme or the other. There is a silver lining to this, however. Although some representations are misguided with how autism is depicted, the understanding that there have been many depictions of individuals with ASD being showcased in the media is a testament of how many people want the disorder to be represented. There appears to be a notion to better include those with disabilities within the media, especially in recent time. This has led to the spread of awareness about ASD, and to jump-starting further discussion about the disorder. With the proper amount of research, anyone can understand what it means to be autistic, and how it impacts their lives and the lives of others around them. This is why media representation is important, because there are not many ways one can properly learn about ASD other than to be taught in school. And when I say school, I mean like for their major, like neuroscience or something. Now, let's bring out a good comparison. Unlike most other awareness campaigns, ASD is more complicated to understand. There are multiple symptoms with multiple interpretations leading to a spectrum of many finite points. The average individual will be overwhelmed when trying to keep track of everything, which is why it is easier to think of those diagnosed as socially awkward savants. The desire for a simple explanation of ASD has turned people away from properly understanding what the disorder is like. Another difficult issue to overcome is that the people who are spreading awareness are often not autistic themselves. ASD leaves the individual with impairments that affect communication, making it difficult to properly and effectively express what they want to say and how they feel. This has led to others who are neurotypical to represent the autistic community. While there are some who are capable to speak publicly, the vast majority cannot or have difficulty with providing their experience and perspective. In comparison to other campaigns, Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of color who spoke up for other colored individuals. Caitlyn Jenner is a transgender woman who brought awareness to many about transgendered people. These are leaders who inspire others both within and outside of their representative minority group. They inspire greater conversation about the issue that they bring up and act as role models for those that they represent. There has not been someone as noteworthy to represent with ASD. While there are individuals who do speak up for ASD awareness, no one is as much of a household name as King or Jenner. This has led to the lack of a proper role model for anyone with ASD, and has left it harder for someone to properly understand the perspective of someone with the disorder. Okay, I'm done complaining. It's time to explain some best practices. With all of this information taken into account, it is hard to point out which character or source of media best represents ASD the most. While some are better than others, all of them suffer from stereotyping to some degree. The most often being savantism, obviously. With the proper information about the disorder, it is possible to have a story about or with someone who is canonically autistic without having to resort to previously established stereotypes. or pandering. If a protagonist has ASD, then it is expected for them to be the main focus of the piece and have their story revolve around their disorder. However, Oscar from Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close proves that the main lead with ASD does not have to have their story centered around their condition, and that's under the assumption that he is autistic. Oscar's story is more interested in showcasing the journey around New York and his psychological trauma after having lost his father. While it is important to have stories that focus on what it is like living with the condition, it is equally important to be able to have stories where the main character has ASD and it does not hold as much weight over the story. That being said, their ASD must come into play at some point within the story. Otherwise, there would be no point in them having it. In comparison, if a character were to be written gay, then it should be brought up either through the example of past and or current experiences, and either have it add conflict to the story or allow it to provide discussion for the character to take, and have it line up with their motivation. If a character is autistic, and it holds no meaning or importance for the plot or for character development, then they become an included character. That is not to say it cannot be heavily ignored. While Oscar's autism is briefly hinted towards in the film adaptation, it never truly comes into play in any impactful or meaningful manner. This is because his potential diagnosis is used to explain how he sees the world. He thinks with logic and relies on numbers to guide him towards solutions, an accurate thought process for someone with ASD. If the focus is not around the disorder and is brought up in a largely important way, then the character must exert some traits that are reminiscent of the symptoms of ASD. Some symptoms could include having them repeat phrases or actions, having them speak bluntly and being unaware of certain social stigmas for doing so, having an intense passion for a specific topic or object, or having difficulty expressing or showing their emotions despite legitimately feeling them. These are only a few character traits that properly represent autistic tendencies, yet they do not necessarily fall into the trappings of previously established stereotypes. These characteristics and other possible examples can portray a person with some quirky tendencies while also being a truly faithful depiction of someone with ASD. Also, a lot of these traits sound like anime. I don't know if that's just me, but it's just kind of like, I don't know. It just feels very anime. Your anime is autistic. Congratulations. One example of appropriate representation is Julia from Sesame Street. In episode 4715, season 47, her debut episode, Julia is shown to be painting with other characters, such as Elmo. When the group collectively show their paintings to an adult human character, Julia's painting is noticeably more intricate and impressive looking. The other characters also acknowledge how talented she is. This is done to showcase how those with ASD are highly interested in a particular topic, as stated by the DSM-5. The character Big Bird is shown to have just met Julia for the first time, and wants to become friends. When he says hello and attempts to shake her hand, Julia does not respond and continues to focus on her painting. Big Bird is left feeling confused and ignored to Julia's actions. The adult human character explains to him that Julia does not communicate the same way everyone else does. This difficulty with communication is a very prominent factor when it comes to those with ASD. While painting, she uses a brush while everyone else is using their hands and fingers. This is explained by mentioning how Julia does not like the way the paint feels on her hands. It is later shown that she becomes disturbed by the sound of a loud siren. This makes her cover her ears and shake in place. This leads to the adult human character escorting her to a garden at the roof of the building behind them so that she can calm down more easily. This sensitivity to stimuli is another symptom of ASD, and the guiding to a quiet and relaxing location is a very common practice that I have witnessed/experienced. While on the roof, Julia sees Big Bird by the streets below. She then begins to giggle to herself because he is called Big Bird but appears small from her perspective. This creative way of thinking is also common with ASD individuals. Sesame Street has created a character that is very accurate when it comes to portraying those with ASD. Every action Julia makes is a very common trait for the disorder. The only seemingly out of place trait was the way she spoke, as she only says words and not sentences. Like, she says things one word at a time. But every puppet character on the show has a somewhat exaggerated voice and personality, so it is fairly easy to forgive. It is because of these reasons that Julia is, in my opinion, the best example of a fictional character representing ASD. Another example of appropriate representation is with the film Temple Grandin, depicted by Mick Jackson. Mike? I'm going to say Mick. And was aired on February 6th of 2019 on the HBO network. This was a film that focused on the woman of the same name, Temple Grandin, and showed the difficulties of having to live in a time and culture that did not yet understand ASD and were intolerant to the behaviors associated with it. Grandin is shown to think in pictures and is always coming up with new inventions. Through her determination and ingenuity, she successfully helped the cattle industry and made it easier for the cattle itself to have a peaceful existence before they are slaughtered. I know that sounds like a crazy juxtaposition, but even she acknowledges, like, we need to kill them to eat, but at the very least, we could, like, show them a bit of respect before we have to kill them. This film is tricky to judge, as Temple Grandin is a real-life person and has gone through these experiences. While it is a rehash of the savant stereotype, this is because she actually is an autistic savant. While the film might perpetuate the stereotype further, there is no other way to have made the film faithfully. Putting that complicated conundrum aside, the film actually portrays ASD in some of the most accurate ways I have seen so far. There is a lot of emphasis on Grandin's perspective and showcasing how she sees and thinks. The way she is able to keep mental photographs in her mind is cleverly illustrated with the sudden cuts to related imagery. The fast-paced nature of the editing, while seemingly jarring, is actually very faithfully recreated for the sake of showcasing perspective. And it's not done so much to the point where it's a detriment to the film, at least in my opinion. It was also refreshing to have her shown to be imperfect in ways other than with social interaction. She is shown to freak out and have mental breakdowns with less than pleasant faces. She punched someone for throwing sawdust on her and has had a history of getting physical in similar situations. Showcasing these shortcomings is important to better represent someone with ASD, as it provides context to them not being completely perfect all the time. Very rarely have there been character flaws of ASD representation that exceed being just difficulties in socialization and taking things literally. The film does everything in its power to provide the most accurate point of view of someone with ASD as it can. While the film does not help to disprove any previously mentioned stereotypes, it makes up for this by giving, in my opinion, the best example of being in the mind of someone with ASD. Of course, that is if you don't take the editing literally. It's giving you an idea of how they think, not literally what they think. Or maybe it is for her. I can't say, because I'm not Grandin, and I would like to think that I probably think differently from her. Proving my point. The purpose of representation is to have a minority showcased for the majority, as a means to have an example to look at when explaining what the represented aspect is like. Having inaccuracies can lead to unfortunate misunderstandings and unintentional consequences. From a personal perspective, watching what little representation there was of ASD, I used to think that I was not smart enough to justify my own autism. It is not enough to have professionals monitoring your representation of ASD and explaining whether it is possible or not. The people involved must also take into account how the viewers take in what information is provided to them, because many, especially the uninformed, will take what they see as fact. And now, with that awkwardly conveyed transition, allow me to indulge into some personal experiences. As someone diagnosed with ASD, it has become very disturbing and worrying with the popular type of representation there is for ASD. I was never aware of my condition until I was told, and that is because of how well I was able to seemingly fit into society, at least for the most part. Even at a young age, I was seen as weird and eccentric for my behavior and actions. It did not seem to bother most people from what I saw, as many still knew that I was intelligent enough to keep up with everyone else in terms of grades and competent enough to hold proper conversation. While growing up, it was a big concern of mine to get better at acting appropriately towards others and overcome other shortcomings of my condition. While I still have room to grow, I have been able to accomplish much despite how limited I might appear to others. I'm currently a senior in college writing this thesis in hopes of graduation. Update on that, I'm currently a college graduate. Suck on these nuts, this paper got an A-. The struggle for me to get this point was difficult, as it would be for anyone, but the experience I went through personally is one that has not been expressed much when it comes to media representation. The stories showcased seem to be more focused on larger-than-life experiences, and while that can be entertaining, it is not a fair assessment. Whenever I gave an explanation of my disorder to someone, they used to tell me how surprising it is for them because of how normal I would act or appear or whatever. Whenever it is brought up as a topic, like to this day, I'll either get that response or I'll have people who know me better go, "Oh yeah, I kind of assumed that," or "Oh yeah, that makes sense." It's either they assumed it was the case or they had no prior assumptions whatsoever. But more often than not, when I was younger, it was very much the latter. One possible reason for the influx of savant stereotyping was to showcase the positive traits of autism. The issue is not what tone they were choosing to take, but rather how far they went with developing it. As mentioned before, I used to think I was not smart enough to justify my diagnosis because of how impossibly smart the media made every character. Now I feel more worried about how others might expect more from me than what I'm capable of. This representation is important, not because of how the world sees those with ASD, but also because of how those with ASD see themselves. Homestretch, boys. It's time for the conclusion. ASD has had many conflicting representations. From the faithful to the stereotypical, the inconsistent results of reliability can be troubling. The more upsetting matter is in the more consistent use of stereotypes across multiple media styles. The majority of every functional form of media incorporates some form of stereotyping, most notably that they are also savants. The only exception to reliable stereotypes are with the news and internet, but considering that is more focused on real people rather than fictional characters, they tend to possess their own set of stereotypes independently from the other media outlets. Implied characterization of any certain minority group should not be tolerated in any highly developed society. It can lead to pigeonholing and potential discrimination. The issue is that ASD is seen in our society as less important as other minorities, as they are seen as either intelligent enough to function in society or mentally deficient to the point of needing to be put in a group home. Additionally, we live in a society that believes the term mental health refers to either depression or anxiety. None of the other mental disabilities, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or autism spectrum disorder, get as much attention because they are not as relatable. Everyone can feel depressed or anxious, but not everyone can relate as easily to something as broad and non-specific as autism. This is not to say depression or anxiety do not have any type of stereotypes for themselves, but I find it reasonable to believe that more people are accepting of anyone with those disorders than less mainstream ones. God, I feel like an asshole having to brag about my hipster diagnosis. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from with this. I'm not trying to belittle anyone with a disorder that is more common. It's just that those that are less common are not categorized with the rest of them, or at least seen as important. Or even if it is as important, they just don't see them being the same kind of thing, or even important at all. I think I'm talking in circles. Repetition, it's a symptom. With the generation that I have grown up in, there is seemingly a desire for everyone to find equality and acceptance among many social avenues available in life. This could be, in part, thanks to the internet and how it has brought many people closer together than ever before. This is ultimately a complete positive, but there are more toxic individuals forcing equality into everyone, often to the point that they come across as saying that the minorities in question are better than those who are not. These people are commonly referred to as social justice warriors, or SJWs for short. While I desire equality as much as anyone else, equality does not mean better than others. I am looking for more acceptance and tolerance of ASD. What I am not looking for is an image of ASD where they are seen as greater than neurotypicals. They have almost just as many strengths and weaknesses as anyone else, and I do not want the message to come across as anything more. The idea of making those with ASD out to be savants is going in the complete opposite direction of where we were once at, but it's so far in the other direction that it's just as dangerous. But because we're so perpetually trying to push for that direction, it's potentially even more dangerous, because no one's willing to back off. It's not about making people aware, it's about trying to get people to calm down, and that's kind of harder to do, at least in my opinion. We all deserve a world where we can be seen for who we are, what we are capable of, and to have an understanding of what certain limitations actually mean for us and everyone around us. We just as much deserve a world where we're not seen as a disappointment when we cannot reach the unreasonable heights that are set for us. Given the current social climate, I have high hopes that we can reach a social view of that scale within the next few decades. While I cannot be certain if we focus on truth rather than conventions, I believe it to be possible. Maybe then, theaters will more often play films with more accurate depictions of not just ASD, but of everyone. Thank you for hearing me out on such a very serious topic. I know I don't tend to tackle subject matter such as this. It's very new for me, but at the same time, it's very, very much a strong passion of mine to talk about. I want to be able to bring more awareness of ASD in the future to some degree. I don't know how I would go about doing that, but I think this is the first step forward for me to be able to reasonably accomplish, at least. Thank you for hearing me out, and have a good rest of your day.